Something strange happened on the Ukrainian front this past month, and the satellite maps are only beginning to tell the story. Russian forces launched 7,000 separate assault operations across the line of contact, the highest tempo of the entire war. In return, they captured 14 square kilometers. 14. An area smaller than many municipal airports, paid for with the most intensive military effort the Kremlin has mounted since 2022. But the truly disturbing number for Moscow isn't 14. It's the negative sign in front of it. Because while Russian assault columns were grinding forward by meters, Ukrainian countermaneuvers in other sectors were taking back more ground than Russia gained. For the first time since the invasion began, the Russian army has posted a net territorial loss during an active offensive push. The visible story is a summer campaign. The real story is something else entirely, a structural failure that the maps are only now catching up to. To understand what 14 square kilometers actually represents, you have to understand what it cost. A 37.5% surge in assault tempo. Hundreds of armored vehicles committed. Penal formations like Storm Z and Storm V thrown across open ground in waves that produced casualty rates rarely seen in 21st century warfare. And at the end of all of it, a gain so small it barely registers on a strategic map. Military analysts reaching for a framework keep returning to the same one: Lanchester's square law. The mathematical principle states that a force inferior in quality and tactical precision cannot close the gap linearly. It must commit exponentially more men and materiel to achieve the same effect. Russia is now living inside that equation. Against Ukrainian precision artillery, fiber-optic FPV drones, and layered reconnaissance, every meter of Russian advance demands a multiple of what it would have cost a year ago. The Kremlin's response to this mathematical reality tells you everything. T-55 and T-62 tanks, vehicles designed in the 1950s and early 1960s, are being pulled from deep storage and rolled back into active inventory, often laundered through opaque military technical partnership arrangements. A nation that branded itself the world's second strongest military is now feeding Cold War scrap into a modern battlefield. That is not a strategy. That is a confession. Nowhere is the confession more visible than in the Donbas. This is the prize. This is what the entire 2022 invasion was nominally about. And in 2022, Russia controlled roughly 77% of the combined Donbas region. The arrow on the map pointed one way, and Western analysts spent 2 years debating not whether the rest would fall, but how quickly. That arrow has stopped moving. Worse, in critical sectors, it has reversed. The line running through Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, Drushkivka, and Kostiantynivka, what Ukrainian command now calls the Fortress Belt, has absorbed everything Moscow can throw at it and refused to break. Russian formations mobilized every available reserve to crack the Kramatorsk-Sloviansk axis. They were halted across most of it. The most revealing evidence isn't coming from Kyiv or Western intelligence. It's coming from inside the Russian war camp itself. Pavel Gubarev, one of the earliest separatist leaders and among the most enthusiastic original advocates for the war, publicly assessed the cost of any serious offensive against the Kramatorsk-Sloviansk line and called, in effect, for the front to be frozen. When the war's true believers begin arguing for a pause, the political ceiling of the campaign has already collapsed. The exhaustion in Russian nationalist circles is no longer something the Kremlin can hide from itself. Move south through the Donbas and the picture darkens further. Near Pokrovsk, the 51st Combined Arms Army, once paraded as the unshakable symbol of Russian military prestige, has shed an estimated 1,642 pieces of heavy equipment in a 10-month operational window. That is not attrition. That is the disintegration of a strategic formation, written in burned hulls and abandoned vehicles across a landscape the size of a small province. This is where the larger truth comes into focus. A single T-90M main battle tank, once destroyed, creates an industrial bottleneck that takes Russian factories months to resolve. Annual production hovers near 240 units, Monthly frontline losses in active sectors far exceed that pace. Every modern platform that burns forces a Soviet-era replacement onto the line. Older armor, weaker optics, more exposed crews. The death spiral is now mechanical, not just tactical. And on the other end of that asymmetry sits a Ukrainian FPV drone costing a few $1,000s, neutralizing a multi-million-dollar platform in under a minute. Forensic satellite imagery confirms what the cost ratio implies. A significant portion of Russia's strategic armor reserves has been consumed since 2022. The Kremlin is not running an army anymore. It is running an inventory clearance. Here is where the surface narrative breaks down completely. Because the question no one in Moscow seems able to answer is this: how does a numerically inferior Ukrainian force, fielding roughly 110 brigades against a Russian commitment of 500,000 to 700,000 troops, suddenly seize the initiative across nearly the entire line of contact? The answer is not on the front lines. It is behind them. Ukraine has executed what military planners are quietly calling a logistics lockdown. A deliberate, surgically engineered campaign to move the war off the trench line and onto the supply arteries that feed it. Medium-range strike drones with 200 to 300-kilometer reach now dominate the corridors running into Luhansk, Donetsk, Mariupol, and Crimea itself. The strike on the Izvorian border crossing, 205 kilometers deep into the Russian rear, was not a raid. It was a demonstration that no logistics node within occupied territory is safe. Behind this strategy sits a $113 million Ukrainian Ministry of Defense allocation and a new incentive architecture called the E-Point system, a competitive framework that directly rewards units for verified deep strike sabotage. Bureaucracy was stripped out. Engineers, startups, and frontline operators were handed an open lane. Hundreds of Ukrainian companies now compete to produce the unmanned systems the military demands, iterating on weekly cycles that no top-down Russian procurement process can match. The consequences cascade outward. Fuel convoys burn on roads that used to be safe. Ammunition depots relocate further from the front, lengthening shipment times. Russian artillery fire rates, once a defining advantage, have dropped well below 2022 levels as commanders ration shells. Ballistic launchers and air defense systems retreat from forward positions to escape strike range, opening Ukrainian cities to slightly less pressure while exposing the operational rear to more. Throughout military history, logistics has been called the invisible spine of warfare. Ukraine is not fighting Russian soldiers. It is breaking the spine that holds them upright. The damage is not only material. Fresh Russian conscripts are arriving at forward positions already traumatized, not by combat, but by the knowledge that they can be killed 30 kilometers before they ever see a Ukrainian uniform. An army that cannot move safely through its own rear is an army that has lost the most basic guarantee of military organization, the assurance of a secure supply chain. When that assurance disappears, offensive operations become impossible. Units shift instinctively into survival posture. Initiative dies. And the commander reading bad maps in Moscow keeps demanding the same impossible advances because the Russian general staff's institutional reflex, inherited directly from the Soviet system, is to feed success reports upward, regardless of ground truth. Putin may quite literally not know how bad it is. The lie has become the system. The Southern Axis tells the same story in a different dialect. Ukrainian forces have liberated roughly 590 square kilometers along the southern front and added 46 more around the crossroads linking the south to Donetsk. The Dnipro direction is no longer static. The map is moving the wrong way for Moscow. And this is where Rob Lee, former U.S. Marine open-source intelligence analyst and one of the most respected voices reading this war in real time, has begun pointing to something significant. Lee's framing is precise. The current battlefield resembles the static trench warfare of late World War I, but the deadlock can be broken through the right technological adaptation. Local pockets of Ukrainian superiority, created by electronic warfare and concentrated drone strikes, could allow modernized Ukrainian armored units to punch 5 to 10 kilometers into degraded Russian defensive structures. If those breakthroughs land at the right points along an already crippled Russian logistics network, the collapse will not be linear. It will cascade. A Russian command structure that has lost the ability to accurately assess its own losses cannot respond fast enough to a fast-moving armored thrust. The dominoes are already leaning. The most consequential terrain for such a breakthrough sits on the eastern bank of the Dnipro and across the southern plains, the corridor that, if severed, would cut the land bridge to Crimea. Should that artery be cut, tens of thousands of Russian troops on the peninsula become trapped in a logistical siege from which there is no overland exit. The strategic gravity of that single possibility is enormous, and the Kremlin knows it. The old assumption was that mass beats precision over time, that a larger army with deeper reserves grinds down a smaller, more agile opponent. That assumption has not survived contact with this war. The emerging reality is the inverse. A distributed, innovation-driven, drone-saturated force can systematically dismantle the logistics of a mass army faster than the mass army can replace what it loses. This is the strategic shift, and the new rule that follows it is one that every military planner from Brussels to Beijing is now studying. In modern war, the side that controls the rear controls the front. Square kilometers are a lagging indicator. Supply lines, production cycles, and information loops are the leading ones. Ukraine has stopped being a country defending its own borders. It is becoming the prototype of European military doctrine for the next 20 years, a live laboratory where the future of warfare is being written in real time and exported to allied capitals before the ink is dry. Russia, meanwhile, faces a menu of options that ranges from bad to catastrophic. Continue offensive operations and bleed faster than the industrial base can resupply. Retreat into a defensive posture and concede that the entire stated purpose of the war has failed. Or watch the front collapse in segments as logistics fail one node at a time. Return to where this began, 14 square kilometers against 7,000 assaults, with a negative net balance once Ukrainian counter-gains are tallied. On a tactical map, it looks like a slow month. In strategic terms, it is the visible surface of an industrial, logistical, and doctrinal collapse that has been building for 2 years and has now broken through into the data. The Kremlin's military parade, the one envisioned in February 2022, has crashed into a wall it cannot climb. What remains is no longer a war of conquest. It is a war of survival, fought by an army that cannot supply itself, commanded by a staff that cannot tell its leader the truth, and opposed by an adversary that has turned innovation itself into a weapon system. Which leaves the two questions that everything else now hinges on. How much longer can a Russian military with paralyzed logistics and casualty rates that vastly outpace industrial production sustain its presence on the front at all? And if Rob Lee is right, if a Ukrainian armored thrust spearheaded by electronic warfare and drone support is the breaking point that converts attrition into decisive maneuver, has the war already entered its final phase without anyone in Moscow being willing to say the words out loud? The map will answer before the Kremlin does.